climate change is a serious issue. We understand why it's a serious issue physically. We understand what we need to do about it. And we know the time frame is very short.
I don't know if you saw a new PNAS Proceedings National Academy paper suggests.
I'm pleased you added that.
That might get edited out. That
PNAS.
PNAS is probably best to spell it out. Yes. Saying that at least until 2013, the denialists were increasing their frequency of publication and activity, not going away. And this is using solid methods. This isn't sort of anecdotal. Anyway.
Though I think we have to draw a quite clear distinction here between the denialists and the skeptical community. I think if we look in the UK and we look in Europe, and probably quite a few other parts of the world, the denialists have never been particularly strong. Or at least they very quickly changed from being denialists to skeptics. I think if you go to the US, you have people there who don't believe in Darwin. I'm sure they don't. I wonder how they.
Most of the Republican candidates.
Yeah, I always wonder how they get in a car or get in a plane and assume it's going to work, because it doesn't just work on a whim or a miracle of God. It works on the basic principles of engineering and science, which are the same basic principles we use to understand climate change and evolution. So it seems they are very selective in which parts of science they prefer to accept. But I don't think we have that problem within a lot of Europe, at least not significantly. I think the problem we have, in some respects, possibly more dangerous. We still have a lot of very influential skeptics. Now the skeptics now, and it's interesting to see how they've changed over the years, they now say, we accept the IPCC science. By and large, we accept that. We think the climate sensitivity is low, so we don't think there will be such big changes as the carbon dioxide emissions go up, but the temperature will go up. But we'll be so much wealthier that and they're very interesting who they mean by that we will be able to adapt. We will have the wherewithal to be able to respond to these sets of issues. And there are lots and lots of skeptics here who now can hold that position. And that position actually has... It sounds, when you first hear it, it sounds quite cogent, it sounds quite attractive, and it's very appealing to a lot of policymakers, because it means, hey, you can keep the status quo. Don't worry about questioning your paradigm. Carry on doing what you're doing. Tweak a few things here and there. But the economy, by and large, with a few tweaks to technology, will solve the problem for you. Those skeptics are still living and breathing within and influencing within the UK, within Europe, and probably within other parts of the world as well. And I think we have to be very careful about making sure we counter their positions. Nevertheless, I do think that Paris helps us counter their positions, and I think actually their positions are weaker, because we are seeing, things occurring at the moment that are giving people a better flavour of what a climate-changed world might look like. I'm being cautious how I'm wording that, because I know I'm hearing a number of colleagues now saying that what we are seeing are much more linked to climate change events. Climate change has much more influence in them, but in a point where we're having a very significant El Nino year, and probably again next year, I would rather be more cautious and step back from that, but saying the events that we are seeing, they are likely to have been exacerbated by climate change, but they are also being significantly influenced by El Nino. But these sorts of events are giving people a flavour of where we are definitely heading if we carry on emitting CO2. This is a taster of the new normal. Now, whether in fact at this moment it's the new normal, I think that's something we can only historically tell when we look back.
Well, James Hansen came out in '88 and said this drought is the new, and people scoffed at him.
Yes, yeah. Now, he may well. I'm not saying this isn't the new normal. I'm just saying we have to be quite cautious with the science. Yes. There's sufficient uncertainty within science and sufficient range of opinion within the science to say that what we're seeing at the moment, it could be just extreme weather events exacerbated by El Nino and to some extent by climate change, or it could be that actually this is very much the new normal with a very significant climate change signal in there. Yeah. But I don't think we could.
No, we'll be able to tell in hindsight.
Without telling in hindsight. But I think we can very clearly say that what we are seeing is this is what we will get as the new normal if we carry on as we're going today. And we're probably going to get something very similar to this anyway, because of the current level of emissions that we've already put into the atmosphere. But it would get much worse than this if we carried on.
Okay. I'm sure you don't follow the National Lottery, but there's a double, quadruple, gazillion, whatever rollover, and it's 57 million. Now, I've not bought a ticket for a long time, but I'm going to. And let's, for the sake of...
I've never bought... wasn't it John Major that introduced the lottery?
I think it was.
I think it's...
It's a tax on statistical illiteracy. It's a regressive taxation.
Well, I think it was broadly correct years ago that it allows the wealthy going to the opera to be funded by the poor. So I've never particularly liked the lottery. I mean, if we've got that much money around, I'd much rather us be spending it or taxing people accordingly, but not taxing the people that buy the lottery tickets by and large, but taxing people like me more.
So let's assume, for the sake of argument, that my 1 in 14 million ship comes in, and the IMO is, be happy with that, and I win 57 million, and I'll give a small portion of it to climate change action in Greater Manchester and the north of England. Let's say, £50. No, £50 million. And I come to Kevin and I say, Kevin, I've got £50 million to spend on climate change action in the northwest. And I'm asking you, obviously we're going to spend a lot on adaptation, but I'm particularly interested in spending some of this 50 million on sort of what kind of messaging can we do, and what kinds of capacity do we build? Do we tell everyone to go vegan 1 day a week, 3 days a week? What do we do? 50 million. Oh, do we take up full page adverts in the Manchester Evening News pointing out just how useless Manchester City Council has been in breaking all of its promises? What do we do?
Well, firstly, I think we have to sit back and think 50 million sounds like a lot, but not very much. You're not going to build a power station with 50 million pounds. No. You're going to build a small number of turbines. So let's not pretend it's a large sum of money. We cannot give some huge symbolic example of what could be achieved physically. Nevertheless, I do think that one of the strongest forms of messaging is when we can give examples of what can be achieved. So, you can show it being done. And if you can show it being done, and you can have a way of actually communicating that so people can actually see it, so it's not just happening quietly somewhere without anyone knowing.
Yeah, I'll hire a lot of people to retweet it. It's fine.
Well, whenever they, I think we may have to ask the experts you talked about before, the psychologists and the PR people, assuming they know their field well, that what are the ways that the best ways of communicating these sorts of messages? I'm not sure we really know that. I mean, we may be able to communicate incremental messages about whether we should swap from one cereal package to another cereal brand or something, but whether we can communicate, I don't know if we know how to communicate what we're trying to communicate at the moment. I'm not sure we do, but let's assume that these people can help. We employ some of those, pro bono preferably. But the other thing I think that I might be tempted to spend some of the money on, and I have to look at the budgets first, is just, can you give examples, could you demonstrate physically examples of things that we could do on the demand side? So £50 million would go quite a long way on some of the demand issues. So I'm wondering whether there's something you could actually do there to show how it is that people could make significant changes.
When you say demand issues, you mean more than turning off lights?
More than turning off. But more than turning off lights. So it might be, for instance, and these examples have been done before, so I'd have to think whether it was appropriate or not. But like some of the examples when they've retrofitted a street or a number of terraced houses, not one terraced house or two, but could you with 50 million, or could you with a small, let's say half of that, retrofit a street in Levenshulme, so that the street in Levenshulme became much lower energy consumption, removed issues of fuel poverty, made them resilient to a changing climate, and preferably would also make the place a much nicer place to live. So maybe there are ways that you could, if you get the right sort of architects in there are things that you can do that embed all of these things and make it a much more pleasant place to live, for your kids to play out safely. There'd be some greenery as well. So could you use some of the money for that? Which I think you could probably deliver much more than you could by than building sort of some exotic low carbon power station. And then could you then use some of the other money on that to communicate that? Because if we look at Manchester, if you look at the Northwest is awash with red brick houses. We can all build low carbon, zero carbon homes. If we have a plot of land somewhere, this is not a technical problem. It's just, have we got the money, we can build zero carbon homes. The problem with climate change is not about building new zero carbon homes. It's about retrofitting the existing properties. That's a hugely large challenge. And it's about retrofitting at a level that people can understand, that people can, or at least the community can collectively afford, that there are good examples of how it can be achieved, that they understand how they've got to live in those houses afterwards. There were all of that side of things. So my temptation would be probably to try to say, could we demonstrate to normal people living in normal properties within the Northwest what it is that they could deliver. I'd also probably have a small amount of money trying to persuade normal people to remember that actually they're not the main cause of climate change, but it's actually the small percent that are responsible for the lion's share of the emissions. And I would like people to, I wish people were more vociferous about this, and that if you drive a small Fiesta and live in a share a terrace house in Levenshulme, your emissions will be low. But if you drive out to Bramhall, or if you drive out to where I live in the Peak District, our emissions will be high, and we must we need the population to be pushing the fact is that this is a hugely important equity issue. That the lion's share of emissions come from a small percentage of the population. They are typically the wealthy, people like myself, and that we continue to look at climate change on averages, and that is very, very unhelpful. And actually, if we're serious about climate change, not only have we got to change all the red brick terraces in Manchester, but people like me have to change how we live our lives. And I think if we could try and get some recognition of that, and there's some recent work from the Chancel and Piketty work, the Oxfam report showing that 50% of global emissions come from 10% of the population. The top 1% of emitters in the US have a carbon footprint 2,500 times higher than the bottom 1% globally. There is a huge distribution issue in climate change. And I think trying to get that message across is really helpful, because there's no point having policies to reduce emissions from the poor because they have so little emissions. We need to reduce the emissions from the people who emit, and we know who they are.
Anything else you'd like to say?
That's a rapid conclusion. I always find this the most difficult question of all.
That's why I always ask it.
Anything else I would like to say? I mean, I would like to reiterate that last point. You know, if anyone is watching this video, and hopefully a few people maybe...
They do? Oh no, they've been doing well.
I noticed that. Yeah, I mean, people do like these sorts of discussion videos that people have. So I think it's a great way of being able to engage and communicate. I would say, please look at the Oxfam report on how emissions are skewed typically by income.
If you send me the link to these things, then I'll put it in the blog.
The Chancel and Piketty paper is really good. Piketty's quite
Thomas
well
Piketty.
Thomas Piketty, he wrote a paper with Chancel, and Chancel's the first author, so it's always easy to go by the well-known person. So Chancel and Piketty, the Oxfam report, these are really important and show actually where the emissions are coming from, and they give a very different policy suite. If you look at that, you think, well, how would you respond to that in terms of policy? So I think thinking about those things are really important. Think about the equity dimension of climate change is hugely important, which we've not really discussed here. And what are the policy solutions? I mean, lots of people say put a carbon price on it, but of course that is really problematic for the people living in Levenshulme or the people living in the poor
regressive, isn't it?
It can be incredibly regressive. So why not have it so that each unit of power or group of units of power that you consume, then the price goes up. So your first X number of kilowatt hours are very cheap, could even be free. The next number of kilowatt hours have a certain price. The next number of kilowatt hours have a price that's 2 or 3 times that. That requires people who consume far more within their bigger houses or far more fuel in their cars and so forth to have to pay more per unit of energy. At the moment it's exactly the opposite. The poor pay the most per unit of energy. Imagine that within a flight. Your first flight is to wherever you might be going, to Rome or wherever it might be you're going, might cost you £200. The next flight then would cost you £400. The next flight would cost you £800. The next flight after that would cost you £1,600. Imagine just doubling that price each time. Now, there are techniques like that which will not stop some people flying.
If I own a private jet, I don't care.
Yeah, well, I don't know. But I think if the prices start going up that rapidly, it's the old story about the chessboard. You put the piece of rice in the first square, and by the end, you've taken up the whole value of the country.
The universe.
Or the universe, yes, yeah. And so, in fact, the less bright people with private jets might think they'll be fine, but they'd quickly realise that maths beat them every time. So I do think that just to recognise that the policy suites we must use must look very different from the ones we typically talk about, and we must embed the equity dimension into thinking about these issues, not just because it's about equity, but because actually thinking about equity will deliver the real levels of change that we need, because in fact it is, the emissions are skewed in a very similar way to income. So that's I think a really important message to get out, and the final one probably would be David Cameron has effectively signed the Paris Agreement. He has said he wants the UK to make its fair contribution to stay well below 2 degrees centigrade and aiming for 1.5 degrees centigrade. Let's hold him to that he has to stick with what he says. Either he does not understand the science. If that's the case, he should not be the Prime Minister. Or anyone else who signs up for it should not be Prime Minister, or he is being dishonest, in which case he should not be the Prime Minister, or anyone else in that position should not be the Prime Minister. So let's take him at his word, let's assume he's reasonably well informed, and let's push people like him to say we need policies that are in line with what you are promising to deliver at these international agreements.
Which would have implications for fracking in the north.
It would have enormous implications for fracking, for airport expansion, for the development of the M4 into Wales, for the types of properties that we build, for the support for renewables, for what we need to gradually phasing out the North Sea oil industry, as we did with coal. And unlike coal, though, we should not be just stopping it and destroying those communities overnight. We need to be phasing out North Sea oil and finding alternatives, which there are plenty of course. The North Sea oil industry is awash with expertise that could be building renewables, could
Offshore
be changing
wind.
infrastructures, tidal bollard schemes that could be helping with trams to make sure our cities no longer have cars in them. There's real prospects to use the expertise that we have that are now currently just producing more and more fossil fuels to be making our world a much more climate resilient, pleasant place to live than we have currently at the moment. So I think there are lots of positive things about the climate change message. The problem with all of this is time. So time and equity would be my two take-home messages.
And cut.
Yeah, thank you very much. So,
thank you.
was that okay?
That was fantastic. And I can't believe that was only, it was 56 minutes.